he's been described as geeky. He seems kind of, I mean, that to me is a bully, a wimpy type of bully who's going after women he can easily kill, torture.
One of the foremost experts on serial killers in the United States discusses the arrest in the Gilgo Beach serial killer case. Thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Angenette Levy. Rex Heuermann is in the Suffolk County Jail after pleading not guilty to the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. The DA says he's also the prime suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Law enforcement says DNA, cell phone, and other digital evidence connects Heuermann to the murders. He lived about 25 minutes from Long Island's Gilgo Beach in Massapequa Park. It's important to keep in mind Rex Heuermann is innocent until proven guilty. To get some insight about the case, I spoke with Dr. Katherine Ramsland, who literally writes books on serial killers. She's interviewed Dennis Rader, the BTK serial killer, extensively and wrote about him in Confession of a Serial Killer, the untold story of Dennis Rader, the BTK serial killer. Ramsland also teaches a class at DeSales University in Pennsylvania about serial killers. What were your first thoughts when you heard that there had been an arrest in some of the Gilgo Beach murders?
Oh, I think that's one of the big cases in my world, the one that's been long unsolved that people have speculated about for a long time, in part because there are 11 bodies and it's unclear that they're all connected to one killer or several killers. So lots of people have been working on the case. And to have an arrest, even just for the four or three, I guess is only what he's been charged with, I think is pretty significant. And the police work on it was quite meticulous. I think it would have been very easy to not have solved this.
Some of the evidence had been around for a really long time, such as the burner phones and email addresses.
Well, sometimes it just takes somebody thinking about evidence in a different way or technology getting better. And certainly with the DNA back in 10 years ago, they couldn't do what they can do now. So had they tested the evidence back then, they wouldn't have had quite the same results as they do now. But the cell phone, the burner phone stuff really took somebody thinking differently about it and doing a very meticulous process of narrowing down things and comparing two witness reports. So I don't really fault them for not figuring this out some time ago, because I think now, and that's really what happens with cold cases. A new team comes aboard. One person thinks about something differently. One person goes out and does something more over and above what they might normally do, like the dog, the person with the dog. That sometimes it can happen. These cases can be a mix of skill and luck, things happening at the right time. So I think when you put it all together and see what the police actually did in this case, it's like what we've done with some other recently solved cold cases.
Heuermann faces charges in the deaths of 3 women and is the prime suspect in the death of a 4th. But what about the other remains found along Ocean Parkway, including the body of a toddler and an Asian man? Could Heuermann be connected to those?
Well, yeah, do not have enough information. That's the first answer. Secondly, it's a myth that serial killers always do the same thing. I wouldn't rule him out, but I do think you can compare things. Now, the toddler was the infant of one of the other victims, who was the mother. So that could just be that the child was with her at the time. She was the target. The child was collateral damage. That's certainly a possibility. I don't think the killer in this case necessarily targeted a child. We also have a male. So we have bodies that were dismembered and with the parts strewn about in distant places. That's a very different kind of approach than the 4 young women who were very similar in size, who were laid out and were wrapped in burlap, strangled, laid out in a fairly uniform manner along Ocean Parkway within about a quarter of a mile. That's quite distinct from the other 6. So I wouldn't rule them out just because serial killers do different things. Sometimes they experiment. Sometimes the early kills are different than later ones. But when we see the four as uniform as they are, and when we learn more about the suspect, who was a very organized person, I think it's more likely that the others are somebody else.
If he is indeed also responsible for Maureen Brainerd Barnes's murder, uh, this would have all occurred between 2007 and 2010. And then we have 13 years where we don't hear about anything connected to him at this point. And of course, he is innocent until proven guilty. He's got a presumption of innocence. Do people just stop for 13 years? Or if he is indeed a serial killer, would you expect that they will connect him to other crimes between 2010 and 2013?
Well, another myth is that serial killers can't stop. That was some of these myths came out of FBI research in the 1990s, and it's pretty outdated, but still out there. Um, he could have stopped, but we don't know that he stopped. He could have just found a different place to put victims. We certainly have serial killers who have different locations for their dumping grounds. Depends on some of the things that happened in his own life. If he might have thought, that was too many in one place, or he might have found a better area. But it's also possible that he did stop. Uh, I think it's unlikely, but it is possible. And we do have some cases where that has happened. I think Dennis Rader is a good example. He will say, even though for between 1991 and 2004, he didn't go after any victims, he said that he was stalking them and looking for opportunities. He just didn't succeed. Even so, he was busy with other things. He wasn't as focused on murder during that period of time. So we do have people who have stopped because circumstances in their life have changed.
As I mentioned, Dr. Ramsland is an expert on Dennis Rader, the BTK serial killer.
I see some similarities with Dennis Rader, the BTK killer from Wichita, but I think he's more similar to Gary Ridgway, the Green River killer, because Ridgway also was married and had a son, but he had that arrogance and that disdain for sex workers. He actually thought, and he killed. Well, he's confessed to 49, but he says it's more than that, and it was the idea that he was doing the police a favor, and we certainly hear the disdain from this suspect because he made phone calls and made statements that are right on display about how he felt about escorts and sex workers. So I see him as more similar to Ridgway. Rader never killed a sex worker. He entered homes. And yes, what's similar is that he was a family man. He was the president of his church council. He had a regular job. He was a neighbor to people. And he had this dark side where he was stalking women and killing them and breaking into homes and doing criminal acts. So yes, we have two people who have the ability to hide the dark things that they do, but I think Rader is really distinctly different in other ways.
I also asked Dr. Ramsland about how this behavior, serial killing, starts. What causes a person to develop into this? Specifically, I asked her about the McDonald's Triad. It comes from a paper published in 1963 in which J.M. McDonald said bedwetting as a child, fire setting, and cruelty to animals were all precursors to serial violent behavior.
Well, the McDonald Triad is not just outdated, it never had any research support whatsoever. So, so how it became this popular formula, I think, is difficult to fathom. There is no McDonald triangle, but we don't know enough about the suspect to really be able to say where it came from. Each person has their own developmental trajectory in terms of their fantasy life, what might have happened. I mean, there is some discussion that one of the victims had scammed him, and then the next day he made another date, and she disappeared. So I don't know what happened, and I don't know if he was doing this out of anger or what. We really just don't have enough information. And serial killer is not a criminal type. It's a description of a behavior. And there's a lot of range of motives and MOs that we have within that description of behavior. So whatever was going on with this man is not going to necessarily be similar to what went on with Rader or Ridgway or Todd Colehep in South Carolina. I mean, they each have their own approach to this, the different things that happened in their life and different reasons why they were killing and different ways that they handled victims.
This may seem superficial, but it's something that's really struck me. And it's the fact that this man is an architect. And I've gone through some photographs and looked at some news stories in which he and his firm have been part of doing some beautiful architectural work. Yet his home, from the outside at least, appears to be, a little shabby in some respects. And I find that surprising for an architect who's in charge of creating beautiful things to have a home that he doesn't appear to keep up meticulously. Is that silly? Does that tell us anything about him?
Well, there are a couple of things. One was a acquaintance of his has reported that he said when he bought the home from his mother, he wanted to keep it looking the way, preserved in the way that his father had kept it, meaning he wouldn't repaint it or apparently repair it or whatever. But then when you see some of the reports coming out now about the state of his brother's house in South Carolina, it's a garbage dump. And so we have two brothers who keep their homes in pretty similar fashion. So it does sound like that reason that he wants to keep it the way his father did probably isn't true.
Dr. Ramsland said, "We don't have enough information about Heuermann's upbringing to know whether the way the brothers keep their homes comes from their childhood." But I asked that question. One thing, though, stood out to Dr. Ramsland.
The thing that I think I noticed right away is this guy is such a big guy. I think he's about 6'4". He's bulky, stocky. And the victims, the four that we're talking about, were these petite women. And I mean, it just must have been, they're already in a high risk occupation. To see somebody like this and to realize that he can so easily overpower them, I just find that really, that he would pick women that he could so easily overpower. He seems, he's been described as geeky. He seems kind of, that to me is a bully, a wimpy type of bully who's going after women he can easily kill, torture, whatever he did. I don't know. He strikes me as a coward.
It makes me wonder if he actually went through with a sex act or if this was more about the killing. Maybe killing was sex for him.
Well, I don't know, because apparently he had a lot of burner phones and was making dates with, other women. So I really couldn't say that. So, sometimes we confuse, we think that all serial killers are getting off on murder, and they're not. Quite a few are just killing witnesses because they want to do other things that they know are illegal and coercive, and they don't want this woman or man to go talk about it, so they kill them. And it's not necessarily the murder that excites them, it's the acts that come before. And BTK was like that. He wanted to bind people and torment them a bit psychologically and strangle them. And it was really more that he needed to get rid of the witnesses. And I think the same thing with John Wayne Gacy. He had gone to prison for molesting a boy. Once he's out, he knows the only way I can get away with this is to kill them. So that's what happens sometimes. So I cannot tell you whether this man got off on murder or whether he just decided to kill these women for some other reason.
Heuermann's next court appearance in Suffolk County is scheduled for next month. For Law and Crime, I'm Angenette Levy.